Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Prichard. I'm the UK Managing Director of Buro Happold, and I'm the chair of the Net Zero Task Force, which was set up to bring the ACE and EIC members together to outline a carbon-free future for our society and our industry. A real challenge, as we all know. As we reflect on COP26, which seems to be ages away already, it's clear that we're moving from a phase of setting ambitious targets to the hard work of delivering it on the ground and really thinking about what that means. We believe one area where the consultancy sector has a crucial role to play is in working with local government to master plan developments to maximize the net zero compatibility. And that's the theme of today's webinar. I think we all know that this is a real area challenge. I'm delighted that we have Carlo Castelli, Head of City Solutions, and Stephen Horrocks, Director of Carbon and Energy Consulting, with us here today from Jacobs, and Sarah Cary, Executive for Place at Enfield Council. They're going to talk us through how this master planning and thinking about net zero worked at the Meridian Water development, which really had that net zero, in the focus at all times. We're also going to hear, after Carlo, Stephen and Sarah have spoken to us, from Sam Ibbott, Climate Change Officer at East Renfrewshire Council, who give us a similar perspective from a smaller local authority. So it looks like a really interesting conversation here today. A couple of things on housekeeping before we start. If you've got questions, and I hope you probably do, can you please go to the chat function in your control panel, and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the course of the conversation after the presentation we're going to have. If we can't get to them, we'll endeavour to make sure that we respond to them after the webinar. We have all your details in any case. You can choose to ask your questions anonymously if you prefer. That's absolutely fine, so don't hesitate to do that. If you miss anything, don't worry. We're going to be uploading this to the ACE and EIC websites, so you can listen again, or if you haven't been able to listen to this during lunch break, you can pick it up hopefully at some other time. Okay, with all of that in mind, I think it's time to actually get into the substance of the conversation. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah, to Carlo and Stephen to tell us about that Meridian Water development. The presentation is going to last about 30 minutes. So we're going to get really, really into this in the next 30 minutes. Sarah, I think I'm handing over to you to start the conversation going. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, from Sarah to Sarah. I'm Sarah Cary, I'm the Executive Director for Place, and along with Carlo Castelli and Stephen Horrocks from Jacobs, we're going to talk you through a really interesting case study from Meridian Water about how the team's been using tools around master planning to reduce the carbon emissions of what is quite a new bit of city, a large development in London. I'm, as the client, just kind of happy to kind of introduce Meridian for you. And I'll do a little bit on this slide, because you can see central London there. And you can also see in the bottom end of your image, the North Circular. And so Meridian Water is just inside the North Circular, next in the Lee Valley, next to some major reservoirs, and of course, the Lee Valley Regional Park. It's about 50 hectares of developable land, which is pretty substantial. We're looking at about 10,000 homes in 6,000 jobs over about a 25-year period. And it's a straightforward master plan in some areas, in that we have a lot of previously developed land that is currently hard standing or there's not much development on it. So in some ways, some of what we're working on is quite straightforward, but in other ways, it's quite a difficult master plan. We've crossed a major train line, which goes up to Cambridge and up into Essex. And then we've got 2 brooks, which have been channelized that are fairly deep, and then the River Lee. And of course, we've got the parks and the reservoirs and some existing houses in the North Circular. So in some ways, it's quite a kind of complex landscape. We've got Enfield Council is the master developer, which means that we are taking on all the infrastructure works and bringing individual plots forward for development. But because of that, we've got multiple sub-projects running at once. We've got a large multidisciplinary team, and we've got phase 1 on site, but we've still got a lot of design, and we've got outline planning for some of it. We've still got a lot of work to do. And Jacob's job and challenge has been to streamline this master plan evolution, and help inform some of the help lead the environmental and infrastructure works of that. So before I hand over to Carlo, though, I was going to tell you a little bit more about the project before he can tell you what they've been doing. There's we have three placemaking pillars, and this is about mixing uses and animating streets. And the main thing about this is that it's not just a residential development. This is a new urban centre for London with things happening on the ground and first floors, some office buildings, some housing. And we want that to be quite a tightly knit, not like houses over here, offices over here, but let's see how closely we can put them together. The second placemaking pillar is park life on your doorstep. This is really straightforward. We're in the middle of the Lee Valley Regional Park, which is a great asset for London. And it's about making more of that. So bringing the park into the development and making it accessible from your doorstep. The third placemaking pillar is your place to make and create. And this is building on an industrial heritage of the Lee Valley in the north of London as a place of manufacturing to support not just office-based work, but kind of maker-space work. And a really good example of that, on the 6th of December, we're opening Europe's largest open access workshop. So instead of like a shared office or like a co-working space, it's a co-workshop. And that's called Building Blocks. So a good example of what we're trying to deliver over the course of the project. On the next slide, I'll talk to you, just mention our environmental sustainability strategy. It's going to come last in explaining the project vision, but it's definitely at the forefront of what we're trying to do in terms of design and engineering. And on the slide, I've got Kate Raworth's donut economics, because it's really that trying to find the donut middle between our social foundations. We need more homes in Enfield. We have overcrowding, we have a growing population, and our ecological ceiling, which of course is our carbon budget that we're trying to work to keep the world at 1.9, I think is what's been agreed from the last COP26, and finding that safe and just space has been a real inspiration for us as a project team. But we've got three big themes and three strong commitments within that. The first one is being carbon neutral by 2030 and striving to be carbon positive over the whole life of the development. And we're looking at, in particular, not just operational emissions, but embodied carbon, which I'm quite passionate about and think is a big part of what we need to do to make development better for future generations. Then environment positive, and of course we've got to be net biodiversity positive, but we're looking at a wider set of environmental metrics. And as part of that, have had a real focus on public open space. So access to green space, that park life on your doorstep, is a big part of our environment positive goals. And then the last one is in some ways, I think the most difficult to tackle. And this is about being zero waste and circular over its lifetime. And the immediate goal we're looking for is 30% of materials to be recycled, natural or local. And as just an example of that, we are decommissioning buildings and piling up materials for future phases to use. And we're working with other developers in the area to do that, so that it's not just about kind of helping them reuse materials. So trying to get a circular economy going for construction in North London. So that's the environmental sustainability strategy. And I'm going to hand over to Carlo and Stephen now to talk to you about how they've actually done it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm delighted to be here as part of this event to kind of talk a little bit about how we supported Enfield and the broader team on through the master planning approach. This is an emerging master plan, so everything that you will see is not kind of set in stone as yet, but it's kind of a process a little bit about what I want to talk to you about. Sarah kind of talked eloquently about the strong vision, the bold vision that Meridian Water has given itself over the last few years, and actually kind of how public sector is at the forefront of delivering this fantastic development. We came on board last year to kind of really support the whole kind of emerging master plan process and strategic infrastructure assurance and so on. But one thing I want to kind of talk about today, which I think is very relevant, is that how you bring that vision, both for the three pillars and kind of carbon positive ambitions after 2030 and so on, and somehow really can establish some targets that can be also used to assess at any one point in time the master plan, so the master plan really supports, underpins and delivers the vision that Sarah talked about. So we use geodesign approach and methodology as a way to kind of really put data and evidence at the core of the process. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but a key thing here is that streams and kind of disciplines are often kind of working in silos. And particularly, you can imagine how in the last 18 months have been even more challenging when, particularly during the hardcore lockdowns, we were all sitting in our living rooms and kitchens to kind of work on this fantastic project. And so having a centralized kind of data source and really looking at the synergies and the conflicts and support really understanding how those pillars and relative objectives and KPIs were supported and delivered was incredibly important. There's a lot of information in this slide, but I wanted to emphasize how that interdisciplinary, fantastic team of companies and consultants have been working together with us. Kirando Sjöberg, Periscope, May, Useful Projects that deliver the environmental sustainability strategy, and Free Studios and others, really kind of coming together as a whole around data and evidence to shape the emerging master plan around those carbon positive and zero carbon objectives. There's a strong methodology where data flows are incredibly important, how you measure, and I'm going to give you a couple of concrete examples about how this manifests itself, hopefully with the help of technology. So once you got all the parameters, coming from the vision, then you can actually establish a model, the master plan, and really can look at the key sort of metrics that you want to kind of keep under control, and really use that as a working tool for the team to deliver and to evaluate and assess options during the master planning process. Obviously, that's true in a number of areas, but one example I thought was particularly relevant, straight onto one of the pillars, as Sarah mentioned, Park Life on Your Doorstep. We established with the team and the client, of course, with Enfield, we established a number of quantitative and qualitative parameters that were deemed to be critical in order to assess the quality and the where the master plan was sitting compared to that particular parameter. So if you take green open space, we were able to measure it, the 30% of truly accessible open space that was a set target from that point of view. Also kind of talking about the three elements, environment positive and zero carbon and so on, and really assess and evaluate the master plan throughout the course of its emerging definition. So you can see here on the screen some examples of these dashboards that eventually give you, at any one point in time, a rendered assessment of the master plan itself. With this, I will hand over to Stephen, who will talk to you a little bit more in detail about the whole life carbon positive approach.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So our approach here was to work with Enfield and also Enfield's other partners to sort of drive and understand this, the ambition that Sarah mentioned right at the beginning, which was around carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon positive over the whole life of the development. And this is a significant development that goes over decades, and it sort of it means that for us that it's both a challenging but also a really exciting piece of work because of all the different inputs, all the kind of the changing dynamics of this project. So I'm just going to very quickly run through the scope of the works, the model structure that we applied, and data and inputs and outputs. So just to be, as I mentioned, this is an incredibly complex development. There's a lot of changes happening. So first of all, we have to understand how are we going to actually reach this sort of this position, the ambition of Enfield on this. So first of all, we had to sort of develop up this first phase whole life cost carbon cost model. Now it's probably not as detailed as everyone on the call may may think it is. It's first of all, it's to really understand where the carbon has been derived from and understand that carbon intensity and cost and benefits. So it's just really important that this is the first part of the, I suppose, part of the phase for Enfield and also the wider partners to understand how the carbon has been derived, how we can kind of mitigate that carbon in line with the environmental sustainability strategy. So there's a lot of inputs that went into it. So first of all, as Carlo mentioned, all the master planning work that has been undertaken through things like the federated model. So that will help us derive where the scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions come from, both in terms of the construction side, so the embodied energy within that, and then also once the individual developments or components of developments moves into operations, how they then the carbon is derived from both the users and also the residents and the businesses within there. Then just the scenarios. So we have developed with Enfield's other partners the environmental sustainability strategy. So working closely with those other partners to understand how the environmental sustainability strategy baseline, but also how an innovative scenarios can then sort of help drive carbon out of the construction operations. And that's really important. So we're working on sort of two scenarios, against a kind of a business as usual baseline. And then working through the options in terms of what can be done in terms of design. And finally integrating some of the analysis that we've worked on to understand what's the cost associated with that. What's the cost associated sort of going further to try and sort of mitigate further carbon out of that, out of the actual development. So if we just move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of inputs and outputs to this, and we had a fairly short amount of time to sort of try and pull this together, and we pulled it together in August in 2020. So makes you realise that this is right at the front end of the development. Now, the importance of the front end of development, as probably most of you on the call are kind of aware of, is that where we made the most impact is right at the front of design. So right at the front of master planning, and working with Enfield and the partners on this has been fantastic because it gives you that ability to actually sort of design out carbon as much as you can to meet those ambitions. So the inputs, just very quickly, the federated model. So that was the key model that Carlos described earlier in terms of how we're phasing the developments in Meridian. And there's a lot of technical detail that goes into that federated model, including the construction component parts, the materials, the sizing and everything else. We're also working up, we worked up an energy model associated with that. So where the energy is going to be derived from. So in the case of Meridian, there's obviously the district heating being developed as part of the energy from waste facility close by, but then also a lot in terms of the materials in the buildings. And the waste and circular economy model, so understanding, you know, how we're going to apply that construction, the circularity of the materials being used for both construction and also in operations. And then in terms of logistics, where the carbon's going to be emitted from in terms of transport, where's the actual materials going to be derived from, how is it going to get here. So what this spits out is a whole range of things, both technical in terms of carbon, but also financial. So we derive this whole life cost carbon, so tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year over the course of the development up to 2050, and how we break those down into the embodied, the operational and user, apply the total project cost to this, and then understand how we can mitigate that carbon through the marginal abatement cost of ideas, of concepts, of technologies, whether it be renewable energy generation, whether it's new materials, or whether it's a way of working within the actual development. And then also what's the economic benefits of that. So in terms of how do we look at the social value in terms of changing out certain things to then apply a carbon, associate with the carbon mitigated. Okay. So I'm going to very, very quickly in the next couple of slides just get into a bit of the sort of the technical, but as you can appreciate, there's a lot of inputs and outputs from this that we're not going to get into, but you get a feel for actually how the model was constructed and how it's also going to be used going forward. So just very quickly, obviously a model like this does spit out the emissions. So we understand what's the carbon intensity of all component parts of the development, as I mentioned, for the two different scenarios we looked at. And we're looking at offset costs also. So actually, there's always going to be elements that you can't mitigate out of this, whether it's the embodied or user. So we need to understand how much is it going to cost the development to reach that 2030 target, but also carbon positive target by 2050. And again, I mentioned earlier, to support that, we'll look at the marginal abatement costs of different options, and then the economic benefits. I won't go into the key considerations, but I think the slides are going to be sent around afterwards. But we can discuss them outside of this call, outside of this webinar, if required. So if we just move on to the next slide. So I've talked about the two scenarios. So the baseline scenario of the environmental sustainability strategy, but also the innovative one. Now we had quite a lot of debate going into this in terms of how do we set the baseline. So usually, you set a baseline in terms of your existing regulations at one point in time. But in this case, we knew that new regulations were coming through. And it was really important that we actually factored in some of those new regulations that were coming through. So we also applied this most likely regulatory scenario for things like the London Plan and also building regs. And then as part of that baseline scenario, a series of KPIs were developed through all the different the modelling and strategies that are sort of set out in the graphic below. So looking at things like the energy model and strategy, all the way through to the kind of the consumption patterns of the users within there. So then in terms of the innovative, this is where we're looking at, okay, well, what can be achieved in the process of the development? So, what's best practice now? What's interesting technologies are coming through that can make, that can be anticipated so that we actually really sort of hit that high level and all the KPIs that's set within the environmental sustainability strategy. So the model had basically two scenarios that we ran through, but within the model itself, and if we just jump onto the next slide, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details between the construction, the product manufacturing of the raw materials. So, for example, the steel and the cement, how it's got there. And then working through into the construction side, so the transport materials to sites, the waste that's derived from that construction process, and so on and so forth. And then moving into the scope 3, which is in the bright blue color. So looking at the user. So when we start, as the development starts to become operational, insofar as businesses come in, and residents come and live there, then we start sort of developing up that sort of scope 3 emissions around, okay, well, what are the user emissions from actually being there in terms of transport? So moving from the residents to their place of work, and also people driving in to the businesses that will be operating there also, as well as the kind of the usual emissions that we associate with residents. What we don't capture though is the end of life. Now this is something that we need to pick up separately, but because it doesn't necessarily give you that kind of full-on true whole life cost. But obviously, as you'd appreciate, we're looking at a carbon positive position by 2050. But a lot of the true end of life of the development is going to come way beyond 2050. So that was taken out of scope here. So here we have the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and that sort of sets the boundary for the carbon model. If we just go into the next slide, we'll just pick up where some of this information sort of comes from. So the federated model is, as you can imagine, it's a model that doesn't I suppose it doesn't really stop as we start working through new developments. We start sort of designing new developments, whether it's roadways, whether it's buildings, the type of businesses that are going to be there, like what Sarah mentioned right at the beginning. So we needed to take a cut in terms of actually sort of setting what that model is going to be worked against. So that includes things like the construction, when the construction starts, when the construction finishes. It's also looking at some of the assumptions around the actual buildings that are going to be there in terms of the size of the buildings, how many individuals are going to live in those buildings and also work within the businesses there. So again, this is just it's a very small snapshot of something that we needed to create within the actual whole life cost carbon model. So just moving finally, just to close this off. This is really a kind of a summary of how the numbers have been derived. Now, first of all, apologies, I've taken all the numbers out. I didn't think it was appropriate to show all the details of the numbers within this, but I'm sure we can pick it up with Enfield, whether outside of the webinar, whether people want to sort of really jump into the detail. But just importantly, Sarah mentioned right at the beginning about the importance of embodied carbon. So by 2030, the total carbon emissions, the percentage that came from embodied was about 87%, which is not surprising because you are going through that construction period. And as we move between 2030 to 2050, we shift to a kind of an embodied carbon position of about 69% of the total emissions. User carbon, again, user carbon is more around sort of the transport side of things, but as we move from 2030 to 2050, that was moving into about 18% of the total carbon. So again, a lot of emissions coming from existing vehicles that haven't quite shifted yet through to EVs or hydrogen. So this is sort of showing the balance of the negative carbon. So negative carbon being where we've got renewables on site, through to the embodied carbon, which is obviously the carbon intensity of the materials that we've applied in building, then through to the user and how the residents are kind of operating the buildings once they're in place. Now the numbers at the top. So one thing that we did look at as part of the whole life cost is how do we get Enfield to this carbon neutral position, and how far off carbon neutral is it going to be? That then means that we'll have to offset the emissions to meet that 2030 target, but also to meet that 2050 target of carbon positive. So we've run some numbers that sort of looked at the baseline and also the full environmental sustainability strategy. Now, what we're showing here is the full environmental sustainability strategy, and by 2030, what we have to offset is about £11 million worth. Now, that's coming through the kind of the GLA offsetting fund, using the prices at that time. What's really interesting, and sorry, by 2050 to be carbon positive, then we're looking at about 80 million. But what's really interesting is and this is where the marginal abatement cost curve work comes in, insofar as if you only did the baseline as opposed to the full ESS, what the cost would be there. And I think it was 18 million for 2030. So you're basically making a potential saving of 8 million going to a full environmental sustainability strategy. And there's about 80 million difference by 2050 as well. So again, it's working through, the where your carbon is emitted from, what the marginal abatement cost curve in terms of technologies can be, and actually how that is better business case for actually meeting those targets. But again, as I said, there's a lot of changes with regards to how the development works through, new regulations coming through, such as EV, and also how we work through the supply chain to try and decarbonize a lot of the heavy embodied materials like steel and cement. So I think that's me, Carlo. I think it's back to you.
Carlo, did you have more to say at this point, or should we be going to Sam?
No, we can go to Sam, and I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe we...
That's absolutely perfect. Look, I'd like to invite, thank you very much for that presentation. I'm going to wait a little while and take some questions on it after Sam has spoken. I'd really like to welcome and ask Sam Ibbott, who's the Climate Change Officer from East Renfrewshire Council, to talk to us now with his perspectives, please.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for having me along. I'm actually only going to speak for about 2 minutes. For those who don't know me and I've not met before, I did actually used to work for ACE and EIC, so I may well know some of you, so hello. I've just been asked to speak for a couple of minutes, really, and to join the panel to give some observations on kind of the culture and mindset of a smaller local authority in approaching net zero, and how that affects our approach to things like master planning, because I think it's quite important as a kind of point of principle to kind of recognise, obviously, that the majority of local authorities across the UK are not cities, but of course it's cities, and some of the bigger projects in cities that often get the headlines, but there are a lot of us smaller local authorities who are still trying to tackle this, but from a very different position. So I thought I'd just say some few high-level comments to kind of set this out, and then hopefully join the panel for a discussion afterwards. So it's perhaps an obvious point, I just kind of said it there. East Renfrewshire is not a city. We are a local authority just to the southwest of Glasgow in Scotland. And despite our many connections to Glasgow and our collaborations with Glasgow, we are not Glasgow. And to this end, we don't have the resources of a city, either in terms of our strategic or operational staff, and we don't have the spending power of a city. So Glasgow, for example, particularly in the year of COP26, has a climate team of multiple double digits. I think actually at its peak, it was even triple digits in size. East Renfrewshire, just next door, we have a climate change team of 2. Of which I am one of them as the climate change officer. So I think that's quite important in understanding kind of the limits of what we can achieve and the limits of what we're trying to do when it comes to meeting net zero. So in Scotland, we're legally required to be net zero of all greenhouse gases by 2045, so actually 5 years earlier than England. And I think that whilst we know our ambition within this context, we are also pretty honest with ourselves about the limitations of what we can do within that. And I think to that end, as kind of part of a mindset, we kind of talk about that we don't need to be first, you know, but we do need to be right. And so the phrase we often use for us is that it's get to zero, not race to zero. So I know on kind of webinars like this, you know, we like to talk about big, sexy, leading edge projects, those kind of things. But there's a huge chunk of kind of local authorities that are kind of chugging along behind and doing the best they can to make their contribution towards kind of national carbon reduction targets. It's perhaps less sexy, but collectively across all of the smaller local authorities, you know, we have a huge contribution to make towards achieving net zero. So we do know where we need to get to, but kind of we're pretty much left to our own devices when it comes to working out how we get there. And so whilst as kind of local authorities, we have various outlets for kind of talking to each other and for sharing best practice, there is no compulsion for us to take one approach over the other. And in some respects, we're kind of often walking in the dark, trying to feel our way on a lot of these issues. And this is equally the case, I think, for delivering specific projects, as well as for trying to set kind of broader strategic directions. It requires us, or net zero requires us, to not only do things differently, but to do different things. And for a small local authority who's kind of seen its resources decimated over the last decade or so, that can be quite scary. You know, doing what you know the same way you've always done it is comfortable. And you know how much time it's going to take, you know how much things are going to cost. But doing different things, you know, is a whole new world, and can kind of, I say, be scary to some members of staff, particularly those who have kind of been around for a long time and have always done things in a certain way. So you're asking people to really unlearn a lot of the things they know, and that can be uncomfortable in many respects. And I think what this leads to is kind of great inconsistencies and a lack of alignment between local authorities. And this can often be frustrating for our supply chains and the consultants we use, as well as others. But it is the reality of our situation that different local authorities, despite being equally sized, equal kind of population density, those kind of things, we do approach it differently because, back to this point, that we've been left to our own. The smaller local authorities is that we know where we need to get to, but we will rely on kind of more on consultants and contractors to help fill many of the knowledge and skills gaps that we simply don't have internally anymore due to kind of multiple years of cuts that local authorities have seen. So just to kind of sum up for me really, so when it comes to things like master planning, it's good never to assume that two local authorities are taking the same approach or that they have the same internal drivers to action. So even though we all have this kind of universal end target of 2045, it's worth asking when approaching local authorities, or worth taking the time to understand what their unique drivers and motivations are. You know, have they announced a climate emergency? Have they set an earlier target date for achieving net zero? There was a period of time where I think local authorities were quite naively in some respects announcing or declaring climate emergencies because it made a kind of good press release without really understanding the implications of what that meant in terms of what they are trying to deliver internally, the cost attached to that, the culture change required to achieve that. We actually ourselves have announced a climate emergency, but only a couple of weeks ago, just before COP. Has the local authority published a climate strategy or action plan that will shape their approach to some of these issues, or is it featured in things like a local development plan? But I think, just to finish, I think two key drivers for us on achieving net zero and in terms of engaging consultants, two key drivers to actions for us that really do affect what we do and how we do it when it comes to things like master planning or other individual projects, is it statutory or is it not? That's a very major element in our decision-making processes internally as to whether something is a statutory requirement or it isn't. And in some respects, the 2045 backstop has helped push those conversations internally because that is a statutory requirement. And secondly, perhaps obviously, is there money attached to it? If grant funding is made available by kind of central government, whether that's kind of the Scottish government or the kind of the UK government, if funding is attached, that will help drive our motivators and motivate us to kind of take action. So I could say a lot more, but I don't want to take up the time for the kind of broader Q&A and discussion. But it's just hopefully helpful to have a perspective of a non-city local authority trying to achieve net zero. Thank you.
Sam, that was really an incredibly different insight and really, really useful to compare to what Sarah was articulating at the start of this conversation. Thank you to you all for the passion and the energy you brought to this conversation. It really makes it so exciting. It'd be great to have some questions now. There's two in the chat already, and there's one that's been submitted in advance. Please do let us know if you've got any questions, and we'll endeavour to get to them in the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, so the first question was pre-submitted. I think it's important if you're pre-submitting a question, we get to that one first. And the question that's been asked is, and I think it's one for everybody, what's the biggest challenge for net zero in the built environment? Now, it's really interesting. I'm just going to say a couple of words in advance of calling anyone. From my perspective, one of the biggest challenges I think we all face is making sure that clients are on board with the vision, with the aspiration, with the challenge of us reaching net zero, and actually working with consultants teams in order to make it possible. And I think we're really fortunate in terms of having both Sam and Sarah talking to us today with the real passion they've brought to the conversation about what a client can do in terms of articulating that need and really imbuing it in the work of the consultant team. So can I maybe hear from we'll go back in the same order. Sarah, can I hear from you? What do you think the biggest challenge is for net zero in the built environment, please?
I think there's a broader challenge with taking action on climate change generally, whereby the impacts you're having on the environment isn't manifested in any way financially for whether it be the client or indeed users of the buildings actually. And that requires regulation and a lot of different things to solve it. So I think there's that just fundamental mismatch. That's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I'm going to use it to say that I think in the short term, the lack of regulation, good regulation around operational energy in buildings and in embodied carbon is the biggest challenge. I don't think building regulations are good enough. I don't think they work for complex buildings, and I don't think they are pushing enough for the industry. And I think government is worried about raising costs on development even more than they are. But I think that's something that national government should be leading on. And everyone's like, oh, local government could set their own standards. I was like, I don't set my own standards on fire safety. Like, why should I do them on energy? Like, it's not, we should have government regulations that put us in the right place for this. So I think on embodied carbon, we just don't have any regulations whatsoever. And I think it would be good if we did. And I think the industry would move and become much better at it, even if we started with disclosure as a way of on building materials. So that's my short-term challenge. I think there's a bigger challenge about how we continue to use concrete in the long term, but I'll let an engineer answer that one.
Excellent, Sarah. That is so well articulated. I think many of us in this area feel equally challenged by by the lack of regulation. Carlo, Stephen, what are your thoughts on the biggest challenge?
One thought for me is that the biggest challenge is actually the way that we look at COP26 Glasgow, having left there, and you say, Sarah, seems like a long time ago. It's actually the fact that it's actually been a good COP versus a bad COP with an easy joke. But the thing is that it hasn't been as transformational as it should have been. It's been a good step in the right direction, but not as transformational as it should be. And I think that that's the biggest challenge in my mind, is actually really start seriously think about what is the cost of doing nothing or not enough, but even better, what is the value of achieving a better approach to carbon and the overall kind of picture. So my point here is, if we really kind of transform the challenge in an opportunity and really think about quality of life, well-being, long-term resilience of our societies, then we push the value up, and there's so much investment potential and patient capital ready to jump on good projects from a ESG point of view and so on. So I think we are in a perfect storm. If we are really ambitious, paradoxically, it probably unlocks funding, really kind of Sam's point as well, is it statutory or not, and where's the money? But actually, if you push the value up, even maybe beyond statutory, maybe you also find the money. I don't know.
Thanks, Carlo. Well, points well made. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't think you look at the numbers, and embodied energy, embodied carbon has got the greatest. And the problem there being is that you get into a whole kind of wealth of challenges around the global and also local sort of policy frameworks, regulatory drivers around decarbonising steel, decarbonising cement, and then we're looking at fuel switching, changing of fuels. And one of the things, picking up on the COP conversation, is everything's about collaboration now. Collaboration between supply chain, between industries like ourselves, as well as local authorities, as well as whoever makes the cement and the concrete and the steel. But at the same time, there has to be a business case there. And if you don't have a business case there, organizations aren't going to do it for the love of their ECG section in their accounts book. There has to be drivers, economic drivers, and sort of regulatory drivers to make it happen. It's not an easy answer at all, and these questions never are easy. But I think in terms of what we're looking at here in terms of development, we all know that the most amount of carbon comes from that supply chain, and it's how do we decarbonize that supply chain.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. And I think that ties well in. I'm going to call on Sam next, but it ties well into some of the points that he was making when he was talking to us a few minutes ago. Sam, thoughts from you about the greatest challenges?
I'll just actually just a quick point about kind of supply chain emissions, because it's something that's very topical that we're working on at the minute. We recently had a consultant do a carbon baseline for ourselves at the council, and about 58% of our emissions are in our supply chain. So unsurprisingly, it's our largest emission source. But kind of to this point about inconsistency between local authorities, we in Scotland have to do a kind of annual return to Scottish Government, which sets out our emission sources, where our emissions coming from. And the guidance on that is pretty vague. And so some local authorities, ourselves included, do include our kind of scope 3 supply chain emissions in our carbon baseline. A lot of other local authorities don't. Partly because it's hard to work out in some respects, at least hard to work out particularly accurately. Secondly, of course, it puts your total emissions up hugely, so it makes you look a lot worse very quickly. But I think it's an important, it's always a good example of kind of this inconsistency between local authorities and trying to compare what two different local authorities are doing, because again, it's this point where we know where we got to get to, but how we get there is completely up to us. I just want to say that because I say the scope 3 thing, I think is quite important that different local authorities approach that differently. But on the biggest challenges in the built environment, I mean, it's been touched on already, really. Regulation and money are the two obvious things. For us, as a kind of hard-pressed, smaller local authority, if it's not statutory, it's optional. And if it's optional, the option will usually be to not do it. Not because we don't want to, or because we're not interested, or because we don't have the aspiration to do it. We just simply don't have the day-to-day resource to deliver things that aren't statutory. Indeed, we struggle to deliver things that are statutory anyway sometimes. So organizational culture in a small local authority moves or changes very, very slowly, and regulatory requirements do kind of help to speed that process up a little bit. And the second thing really is kind of important to understand the drivers of a local authority. I mean, one of the things that affects what we do a lot, of course, is our residents. The biggest decisions in the council are taken by the councillors, who are accountable to the residents. You know, we have elections coming up, local elections coming up in May next year. And so if you're trying to put in kind of low carbon infrastructure, something like a cycle lane, I mean, we will all know about this. You know, you try and put a cycle lane in and put it out to consultation to the local residents and see the responses you get. You know, it's kind of 50-50. They either love it or they hate it, and there's kind of very little in between. So in terms of kind of the drivers for low carbon infrastructure locally, you know, we are ultimately accountable to our local residents. It's not just what the kind of people that sit on these kind of webinars think about this stuff. It's what do the people that live on the high street think about it. And that's something that I think on these kind of calls, we don't always take into account perhaps as much as we should.
Thank you, Sam. Really, really good points there. Again, you know, absolute challenge I think that so many of us are facing, and also the power of the electorate. I've got a very specific question, which I think I'm going to put to Stephen, that's come in the chat. But I think, although it's only articulated once, I'd imagine it is a question that many of us have thought about in the course of your presentation. And the question, Stephen, is how did you combine various carbon models, operational energy, materials, transport, etc.? Was it a combination of commercial software, you know, EIS and the like, or did you have some self-built models for, you know, Excel? I think it's probably you rather than Carlo. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'll direct that question to.
It's a very simple answer, actually. There's no software in terms of the carbon modeling. It was very much Excel based, built up from a bottom up position, pulling in the data across all the models that we set out there in terms of waste, energy, and one of the key ones though, I mean, ideally what we were looking to try and do is over time is to try and build this into the federated model. So the federated model is the kind of the all knowledge, the brain power of the wider development. But we're at a point in time, and we were looking to try and as set out at the beginning, is just to understand how the sustainability strategy that Enfield had developed sort of fed into that carbon neutral position by 2030. So yeah, no, I think ideally, I think we all want to do really awesome sort of models and using software, but in this case, it was just a bottom-up build in Excel. a lot of hand holding and a lot of sort of cell crunching, which I'm pretty sure everyone on this call is probably more than aware of.
Absolutely, and I you know, again, I think it's a really interesting and really honest way you've answered that. So thank you very much, Stephen. Another question that's come in, we've got another couple of minutes left, around energy from waste. Oh, Sarah, do you want to come in on the energy from waste or on the modelling?
Oh, not on modelling. I'll leave that to Stephen.
Fine. Am I going to turn to energy from waste and ask you about energy from waste and decarbonising the heat supply?
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. So, I mean, the government has got quite a lot of policy support for heat networks in general, and I think one of the benefits of those, and the government recognises, is that they actually can be kind of fuel agnostic over time. You can connect them to different things and they can all support that. So for those of you who don't know North London, there is what's called there is currently an incinerator, so a straightforward burn facility for 7 boroughs North London waste. So if you live in Haringey, Hackney, Enfield, all of this, it just goes to one plate. Your waste, non-recyclable waste, goes there and gets incinerated. And of course, the government needs to do more on reducing waste generally and waste generation generally. But that plant is, I think it was built in the late 1970s, is very out of date and is not functioning that well. So it's being rebuilt at the moment, but it's part of the rebuilding process. It has planning permission. The facility to take waste heat, so that instead of just burning and emitting heat and minor amounts of emissions into the air, you're scrubbing all that heat and using it to heat at least 20,000 buildings, which are planned, and it can do up to 60,000 homes in North London, is something that the 7 London boroughs who invested in the plant have helped support, and then Enfield Council owns the district heating network itself. So, quite just to say that that's the current reason why energy for waste in there is because Meridian Water is literally across the road from what will be an energy from waste plant. So that's the beginning of that. I think there are lots of other future plans. So GLA is currently funding our heating company to look at connecting to a large gas-fired power station that's also in Enfield, which also exhausts a fair amount of waste heat and potential to use that. But I think more broadly in Meridian, we're kind of expecting lots of more technologies to come forward. Thames Water we're looking very actively at floating solar panels in all the big reservoirs in Enfield. For electricity generation. So there's some really interesting ways of using kind of our landscape, which I'm really pleased about. If you think about Malmo, which is always held up as one of the best cities in terms of use of energy, they basically, they burn waste, but they pump some of it down into the ground and then in the summer and then take it back in the winter. I mean, it's quite big geoengineering actually that they do. And they use the bedrock as a thermal store, which I think is great. So there's a lot of, I think it's good that we can use our reservoirs to think about electricity generation. So, and in the future, if the technology improves, I'm sure we'll use them as some sort of steady temperature base as well for energy. So,
lots of interesting ideas there. Does anybody have any other final comments on that energy from waste that they want to just bring in very quickly? That's okay. Oh, Stephen.
Yeah, no, we had a lot of debate over it. Actually, it was really interesting because, as Sarah mentioned, your embodied carbon, the biogenic and the non-biogenic carbon within the heat, you're never going to get to a zero position. You'll have to offset that non-biogenic. So it was really, we just had between ourselves and the other consultants and Enfield, we had some really sort of the socioeconomic discussions around this, as well as the carbon discussions, as Sarah mentioned. So it was challenging, but it was really good in the way in which we came out of that.
Excellent, thank you. I think that we're going to have to bring this webinar towards a close. It's amazing how time flies, so it is. I think we've had a really interesting conversation hearing about client visions and the challenges that councils and authorities of different sizes have in really making this work. We've talked about potentially, and maybe the next conversation is the need for regulation in this area. I think that's a pretty brave conversation, but probably one that's time we started having. We've heard about some of the challenge about how we deal with, the needs to bring multiple disciplines and multiple data sources together in order to try and get to a holistic solution. It's a real challenge, this complexity. We're so lucky at 2021, we have loads of data, but actually bringing in not only data, but stakeholders. Sam was talking about cycle lanes and the popularity of those. Absolutely bringing those together is a real challenge. Get to zero, race to zero. On master planning, we might be just getting that idea on how we deal with embodied carbon in buildings themselves. But actually, when it comes to this whole master planning and uniting that, it really, really makes for a real challenge. So many thanks to, for everyone who's on the call for listening. I hope you found this webinar interesting. I certainly have had a great time listening and thinking to what's been said. A big thank you to all of our panelists for their authenticity in what they're saying and actually sharing some of those journeys and the vision with us that they've had. Thank you to Sarah, to Carlo, to Stephen, and to Sam. Just a quick reminder, we have recorded the webinar and you'll be sent a link to that later today. You can refer back to it, you can share it with colleagues. We'll also be circulating the slides that were presented so that you have those for information and reference. So finally, thank you from me. Hope you've enjoyed it and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Okay, goodbye and thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.